This week's summary lecture focuses a great deal on the Tet Offensive, and the reason why, and I'm sure you figured this out in terms of the documentary and in terms of your readings, is that the Tet Offensive is a major turning point in the war. Now, both sides in terms of the Tet Offensive wanted to claim some form of victory out of this offensive. And in terms of the North Vietnamese, obviously in planning this, really believed that this would be the way that they weakened the morale of the South Vietnamese army and really broke the position of the United States in terms of wanting to stay and try and shore up South Vietnam. And as we see, even though for the North Vietnamese this wasn't necessarily militarily a victory, it was an absolute victory for the North Vietnamese in terms of the perspective and in terms of how people throughout the world, and particularly the United States, viewed the Tet Offensive and viewed the winner, quote unquote winner, right, of the Tet Offensive. And so for the United States, it's this major turning point that once it was embroiled in the offensive, that the United States believed that it had gained the upper hand in terms of not only this particular battle, but in terms of the war. And the reason why they felt this was because they really felt tactically they had won this particular offensive. And so it was supposed to be, for the North, it was supposed to be this major defeat of the South and the United States, and that was supposed to be militarily. And for the Americans, this was supposed to be, when it was all said and done, they truly believed that they had gained the upper hand because they believed they had militarily won it. But what ended up happening is that the offensive itself, in terms of the tactics that were used, in terms of any sort of upper hand that the North Vietnamese were trying to gain, it didn't work out for the North Vietnamese. It worked out for the United States militarily. But when all was said and done in terms of world opinion, and certainly in terms of U.S. opinion and the opinion of the American media, it was that the North had gained the upper hand in the war because it had embarrassed the United States. And how did it embarrass the United States? Well, it was able to, in the South, be able to, for a very, very short period of time, and I know that this is well laid out in terms of documentary, but for a very, very short period of time, the North Vietnamese and the VC were able to hold the American embassy. And that is what played on the airwaves in the United States. And when that hit the airwaves in the United States, the morale of the American people plummeted. And this is where you see the full turn of the American public as a majority against this conflict. And so that's where we get this idea. And I think that if you knew anything about the Vietnam War before you started this course, the idea was that the Americans lost the Tet Offensive, and the Tet Offensive really was militarily a turning point, and a turning point in terms of opinion. And if you've really delved into this in terms of the documentary and the readings, and now in terms of this lecture, you recognize the fact that the United States really only lost in one particular way, and that was the court of public opinion. And so the feed that came back to the United States in terms of the media was the taking of the embassy. It was all the violence that the American public was able to see on their television screens while they were eating their dinners, you know, and they were watching Walter Cronkite. And so this really is it very well could have been a military turning point for the United States, because the North Vietnamese actually initially feel quite defeated in terms of what it was that they wanted to do with the Tet Offensive. And so what really ends up happening is that, you know, the American military is like, you know, we've got this now. You know, we've actually, the tide is turning here. And that's a huge win for them in terms of suggesting that they've turned this tide. but because of the way that it's portrayed in the media and because of what the American people are internalizing about the Tet Offensive, it really turns the American public against the American military and against the Johnson administration in terms of what the United States is doing, what the objectives are of the United States in Vietnam. And so in terms of this entire plan that the North Vietnamese had, they failed quite miserably in terms of the militaristic aspects of it. But in terms of how it was viewed, they won, and they certainly gained the upper hand. And this is clearly where the war's tide that was already in the favor of the North Vietnamese for a while has fully turned in the favor of the North Vietnamese. Okay, so they had very major objectives here that they wanted to meet. They wanted to have the fall of the Saigon regime. They wanted the full withdrawal of the United States, and they wanted to form a coalition government. None of those things happened because of the Tet Offensive, right? The war continues, and we'll eventually get into the idea of the Vietnamisation of the war. But the war continues here. The Tet Offensive doesn't. The North Vietnamese do not meet their goals in terms of the Tet Offensive. And so initially the reason why they were really suggesting, the North Vietnamese were suggesting that they would be able to pull off this offensive was that they were going to get the U.S. military sort of boxed into a corner, and they wanted to get the United States fully weakened, and they wanted to make sure that the army of South Vietnam had really been decimated in terms of its morale. Well, they never get to that point before the Tet Offensive, and then in terms of the actual Tet Offensive, they're like, well, that's where we'll nip all of this in the bud. We'll push the United States out, and once again, none of this happens, okay? So initially, they have particular objectives that they want to meet in order to perform the Tet Offensive. They don't meet those. And then they try to meet very particular objectives in terms of the Tet Offensive, and hey, they don't meet those either. So this is a really bizarre point in the war, and a bizarre point in this conflict, that we see that the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese rather, that they're really faltering at this point. And here they've had the upper hand for a really long time, and they are faltering. And, you know, by this bizarre twist of fate, they're able to gain a significant upper hand against the Americans, and it cannot be overstated how important this point of time is. So let's move forward. Let's talk a little bit more about the actual offensive, and then let's talk about the really significant consequences of the offensive for the United States of America. So let's roll it back a little bit and dissect the Tet Offensive. First of all, from the perspective of what the North Vietnamese were trying to do with the offensive. Now, the first thing we discussed is that they wanted to diminish the South Vietnamese army, and that's why they're going to hit South Vietnamese posts in the Central Highlands, and they're going to try and hit towns around Saigon. They're also going to hit towns around Saigon because they want to hurt the morale of the South Vietnamese as a whole. Then remember the fact that they wanted to be sure to diminish the United States military and the morale of the military and the morale of the U.S. people by hitting Marine bases, and particularly the base camp at Khe Sanh. So their initial objectives are to significantly diminish these two, you know, separate entities that have come together in order to at the very least hold South Vietnam, and at the larger hope of uniting all of Vietnam under the auspices of the United States and the desires of the South Vietnamese rather than the North Vietnamese, right? The South Vietnamese being not those rural peasants, but the South Vietnamese elites, right? So in terms of this offensive, they have very clear-cut strategies, right? They have clear-cut strategies that they're really trying very hard to harm the morale of everyone involved, but they're also trying to diminish that South Vietnamese army because they recognize the fact that the United States is trying very hard to build this army. And if they can build the army, they will feel much more confident, the United States will feel much more confident in terms of not only sort of unleashing the South Vietnamese army, but then being able to go on and do their own thing in terms of the conflict. Because recognize the fact that what's happening for the United States is that they're putting so much effort into trying to build the South Vietnamese army and to build a very strong base of support in South Vietnam, that it's really hindering what they're doing in their own military operations. So the desire here for the North Vietnamese is to make sure that that divide remains, right? That the Americans can't fully focus on their own agenda, that they have to keep trying to help the South Vietnamese army and building that South Vietnamese base. And so it's their hope with the Tet Offensive that that split, that divide is going to become much deeper because of it. And obviously, as we see, there are ways that occur that have very little to do with these objectives that we've been discussing. So the area that the North Vietnamese are going to hit hard, because it's really the double whammy, right, is South Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese obviously are going to really take it to heart, the fact that they can hurt the morale of the elites, they can hurt the morale of the South Vietnamese army, and they can hurt the morale of the United States by really being able to have a decisive victory, particularly in the South. Even if they aren't able to meet all of their goals all around in terms of the Tet Offensive, if they can just be sure to meet the objectives in terms of the South. And so, as we talked about, this doesn't come to full fruition for the North Vietnamese. All of their objectives for what they wanted in the South would not be met, and that the United States is really able to bat them back. And so this is really, again, this really is a place where it should have been that turning point toward the United States, and it's not. And so the real reason, the crux of all of this, right, and you see this in the video, is the taking of the U.S. Embassy. And that, again, as I mentioned before, is what's fed into the United States in terms of the nightly news. And so it's frightening to Americans, and it's frightening for them to see that here's this institution of the United States that's sitting there smack dab in the middle of South Vietnam, and we've lost it. Okay, we lost it to the North Vietnamese. And what does this mean about the power of the North Vietnamese? And what does this mean about the weakness of the American military? And what does it really mean in terms of our long-term objectives in terms of South Vietnam? The American people are sitting there saying, and they're watching this, they're, like I said before, they're eating their dinners, they're watching the nightly news, and they're watching the American embassy be taken over. Well, this is a very brief thing. They're not able to hold it but for a few hours, right? So in terms of being able to hold the embassy, the point was to be able to hold it, right? The point was to be able to make sure that the operations of the U.S. Embassy could not continue. And the point was to be able to hold it for so long that it would appear really, really bad, right? Well, what the North Vietnamese didn't necessarily realize is that as long as the American people saw the embassy taken, that's really all they needed, right? That's really all the American people needed in order to become completely frustrated and frightened by the conflict in Vietnam. And it was really all that was needed for the Americans to start thinking, maybe we shouldn't be there, and maybe the North Vietnamese are a lot stronger than we thought, and on and on and on, right? So this is really, again, this is that element of this turning point that's the most important thing. And so very quickly, the United States is able to turn it back around on the North Vietnamese, and again able to bat them back and push them back to Central and North Vietnam. And so this isn't something that I would suggest two things. One, it wasn't widely reported, but where it was reported that the United States was able to take back the embassy, to push back the North Vietnamese, and to gain some semblance of control again over South Vietnam, that even when that was reported, the American public had already seen what it really should not have seen, right? It had already seen those images that you'll see in the documentary of the taking of the embassy. It was all over then. And why was it all over then? I mean, think about this for a minute. Why was this the problem? Why was this the point? You know, the Americans had been there for quite some time. The Americans had been giving a lot of assistance, and it was really a futile effort for a very, very long time. So why all of a sudden is it now that this is the full turning point? Because obviously we already have, and we'll be talking about this in a later lecture, but you already have a lot of people protesting the war by the time of the Tet Offensive. That's for certain. But I'm talking about, you know, your average run-of-the-mill blue-collar worker who, you know, supports the American military, who supports the fight against international communism, and all of a sudden they flip too. Well, why is that? Well, clearly, even though we have the Korea conflict between World War II and Vietnam, World War II is still fresh in the heads of the Americans, right? It's fresh in the heads of the American public. And it's embarrassing to see the taking of the U.S. Embassy. And it starts the wheels turning in the heads of the regular American public as to what really is going on in Vietnam. Is the United States going to be able to meet its objectives? Is it going to be able to win? And so you have this stark contrast, right? You have the contrast from the pomp and circumstance and ticker tape parades of the Second World War, and now you're comparing and contrasting it to this, what appears to the American public to be a significant military victory for the North Vietnamese. And so that's clearly, and this is my opinion, a few other scholars' opinions, but it's definitely my opinion in terms of why you see that significant change really almost across the board in terms of the American and public in its opinion. And that really is like, oh my God, we're losing. Oh, we're being embarrassed. Oh, this isn't anything like World War II, is it? And so you're talking about this relatively, you know, 2+ decades of the United States thinking it's the cream of the crop, right? Especially in terms of the military. And then all of a sudden, whoa, what's happening here? And unfortunately, there are those racial overtones, right? Those ideas that, well, how in the world could the United States military lose to a Southeast Asian military, and a ragtag military at that, right? And so those racial issues are going to come into play as well. And that embarrassment of how can the North Vietnamese, how are they able to do this to us? And why is the military not able to bat back, at least in the minds of the American public at this point? Why aren't they able to bat back the North Vietnamese? And hey, wait a second, why haven't we been able to win this all along, right? Why weren't we able to go over there and just nip it in the bud and get it over with? And so all of these things are coming up in the heads of the American public, and there we go, right? This is why we have the turning point. Again, the North Vietnamese, they fail miserably at all of these things that they were trying to do in terms of the Tet Offensive. And, you know, as I mentioned, you know, the United States, this isn't some sort of decisive victory for the United States. They don't necessarily win what's happening in terms of the Tet Offensive, but they're able to thwart the efforts of the North Vietnamese. They're able to push them back, and they're not able to win in the sense that they are able to, fully fortify South Vietnam, because obviously we have the VC that we have to worry about, and they weren't able to, necessarily push the North Vietnamese back so far that they could never come back again into South Vietnam. They weren't able to decisively win in that respect, but they certainly didn't lose either, did they? And so, in terms of this particular moment in time, this is a really bad string of luck for the United States. And this is really for the United States, if you're really in tune with what happened militarily, you know that the United States was able to hit back very quickly. It was not taken at full surprise like the North Vietnamese wanted them to be. The South Vietnamese army actually shows some significant muscle in terms of the Tet Offensive. And so it's really, if it would have been really well analyzed by the media and by the American public, it really could have been seen as a complete opposite turnaround of the war, right? But clearly what happens is not that. And so for the North Vietnamese, this is a pretty strong victory in terms of public opinion. And for the United States, it's a really significant loss in terms of public opinion as well. Before it was revealed to William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, before it was revealed to him that public opinion had turned so violently against U.S. operations in Vietnam, before all of that, he really saw these small victories that the United States had pulled out in terms of particularly the southern portions of the Tet Offensive. He really saw this as a significant opportunity that the United States had found a point in time where its luck could turn. And he really suggests that because of the North Vietnamese losses, particularly in the South, that it really would behoove the United States to increase U.S. troops, to create a new strategy that would push the United States into taking the offensive in the war, push the United States to hit very strategic targets, DMZ bases, to go into Cambodia and Laos, and of course Cambodia and Laos are clearly important here because of the fact that they're these really strong centers for the North Vietnamese to, number one, bring through supplies and troops, but also they're areas that are friendly to the North Vietnamese and are going to continue to allow them to do that, right? So he's suggesting that if the United States goes in there and hits the DMZ bases, it makes sure that Cambodia and Laos are no longer on the map in terms of being able to help the North Vietnamese, and then to start blanket bombing and hitting really hard in the north in terms of strategic targets, that the United States would be able to end it all, to just wipe out any of the support that the North Vietnamese have, to wipe out their equipment, their supplies, their manpower, that the United States really would be able to just finish it, just get it done finally. He sets a number of new goals: securing the urban areas, particularly in the south, making sure that they are able to push the North Vietnamese army out of central Vietnam so they're not close enough to the south, and to really start working to take back the rural areas so that eventually the United States would be able to fully unify the entirety of Vietnam under their understandings, the United States understandings of what Vietnam should be, right? So he really has this all in his sights. He thinks that this is it. This is where it's going to end. He asked for over 200,000 more troops, and he's like, we can do this. We've got this. Well, number one, he has the problem of the court of public opinion, but he also has a significant new problem, which is the Johnson administration is not only going to be quite concerned about the court of public opinion, but it's also going to unfortunately have the one side of, we talked about the idea that there were these two sides in terms of the administration and what they believed should be done in terms of strategy, in terms of sending money, in terms of sending assistance, in terms of sending troops. And we're going to see at this point in time that the more conservative side is going to fully win over, and there's not going to be any significant change in strategy and policy. In early 1968, there was the change in terms of the Secretary of Defense. And so we moved from Robert McNamara to Clark Clifford. And when Clark Clifford was chosen, it was a considerable concern to those people who are more conservative within the Johnson administration about moving forward with the Vietnam conflict. There was considerable concern among them because Clifford was really seen, at least ideologically, as more of a hawk than a dove. And so they thought that the minute that he would become the Secretary of Defense, that he would immediately escalate Vietnam. And he actually doesn't do that. He doesn't really change anything at all that's going on. And if he does try to change anything, it's that he's going to become more and more conservative. But it's the civilian officials that are within the Johnson administration who really took this change in guard and really used it to their advantage. And that's those more conservative ones who really wanted the United States to leave Vietnam behind and to stop worrying about the spread of international communism in terms of Southeast Asia, to extract the United States from what was going on in Southeast Asia, because they really didn't see the value in it anymore. They really suggested that it was hurting the United States much more than any eventual victory could ever help the United States. And so their desire was to really move away from escalation and to move toward negotiations, peace, and then actual withdrawal from Vietnam. And so again, remember that, and you've certainly seen this in the book and the documentary, and we talked a little bit about it last week, that there was this divide in terms of the Johnson administration. There was also a bit of that divide already in the Kennedy administration, but it certainly reared its head in terms of the Johnson administration between the doves and the hawks. And so the doves are going to eventually win over here. But there are really significant concerns that are starting to even hit the hawks, which we'll see with Clifford, that they're really concerned about there being a defeat of the United States in Vietnam. They're really concerned about, at the very least, the United States not being able to create like a stalemate where the North could be the North and the South could be the South, whenever the twain shall meet. And they're really concerned about that the United States isn't even going to be able to do that. And so the hope is that if they move toward the more conservative approach, start negotiations, start the process of withdrawal, that they would be able to at least meet some sort of their initial expectations by not allowing the North to envelop the South into this unified Vietnam. That they would be able to at least keep them separate and at least keep South Vietnam in terms of a friendly government towards the United States. And the hope is that they could at this point build the South Vietnamese army to be able to hold South Vietnam instead of being able to hold and then reunify all of Vietnam. And so there's some real concerns here, and for the doves and now the hawks, I think the larger concern, again, has a great deal to do with what the United States was able to accomplish in terms of World War II. And now look, these short decades later, look where we're at. Like we're becoming a laughing stock. So we've gone from being the top of the heap in terms of our military prowess, and now we're being viewed as being weak. And again, unfortunately, those racial issues become involved in that too. So Clifford and civilian officials within the Johnson administration start talking about the idea of shifting the focus here to peace talks, to blocking infiltration of the South by the North, and shifting all of the, just not the security, but the all of the military endeavors that south of Vietnam would need to undertake, that it would be shifted towards South Vietnam in terms of being the ones that perform the operations, right? So this is all a result of Tet. This is, here the doves and the hawks have been at their throats, right? And all of a sudden, now the hawks are starting to talk about this conservative approach, and the hawks are starting to talk about peace, right? And so it's really it's already something that's being talked about, obviously, but by the time you get to Tet, it's a done deal at that point, right? It's something that they've been floating around, and Clifford really, again, doesn't really change things when he first gets into power, and then all of a sudden with Tet occurring, it's like this is the way to go. This is what we have to do. So we talk a lot about, and we're going to talk about Nixon's Vietnamization of the war, but these are the seeds of it. There were little seeds being thrown around here, little inklings of it in terms of those doves, but this is where it really all turns around, right? So a shift here, number one, in terms of the United States becoming really wary, and then a shift here in terms of after the Tet Offensive is said and done, everybody is significantly concerned about what this is going to do to the image of the United States in the world. Now, another reason why even the hawks of the war were really focused on shutting it down, focused on turning everything back over to the South Vietnamese, was the fact that the war was costing the United States an enormous amount of money. And it was already that the Johnson administration was putting a great deal of money into Johnson's Great Society. So all of his welfare programs, all of the programs that were to combat poverty in the United States. So that was an extremely expensive program. Then you have the extremely expensive Vietnam conflict that's been going on for quite some time, and that the United States was already funneling money into South Vietnam well before Johnson even became the president of the United States. And we just have financial woe after financial woe. Congress rejected a tax increase. There were larger international economic factors involved as well, the weakening of the dollar. And so really financially it was going to become completely impossible for the United States to continue. And yet people like Westmoreland and even Lyndon Baines Johnson believed that the war was still winnable, right? And so this is where we get embroiled in this really ugly mess of, we want to stay, we want to meet our objectives, we don't want to look like fools, we don't want to look diminished in the eyes of the world, we're running out of money, we need to be able to keep the country afloat, not just the military afloat, and on and on and on and on, right? So many issues are occurring that are tied to the war, that make the United States look weak, that's hurting the United States financially, that there are so many different issues and elements of this war that's really affecting the United States position in the world. And the withdrawal from the war is obviously going to create an immense issue in terms of the United States position in the world. But at this point in time, 1968, the real concern is losing, right? We can't lose. We can't lose. We have to figure out a way to save face. And so that's what the United States government is going to be working on, the military is going to be working on, and still trying to perform its duties in terms of the conflict. You can tell already that 1968 is a watershed year. And we not only have the changing of the guard in terms of the Secretary of Defense, we not only have like the split in terms of the Johnson administration, that the Doves are going to start winning over the Hawks. You also see that obviously the Tet Offensive and the subsequent consequences of the Tet Offensive and how that goes completely awry. William Westmoreland is actually removed as the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. This was something that was decided before the Tet Offensive, but obviously it creates some chaos in terms of what's going on the ground in Vietnam. And then you have March of 1968 when Lyndon Johnson sits down in the Oval Office and in a televised address to the American people and says, I am not going to seek re-election for a second term. So the United States is pretty much in a pretty significant turmoil in early 1968. By the middle of 1968, it is in immense turmoil. We have the Democratic National Convention, which is, you guys should look it up on YouTube. I think in the home front portion of the documentary, you'll have some visuals for this too, but I would even look it up. It was a terribly violent convention, and obviously one of the reasons why the convention didn't go off quite as planned was the assassination of Robert Kennedy, one of the candidates for the presidency, and he was shot and killed in June of '68. So there's all of that political turmoil. Then you have the sociocultural turmoil of people like Martin Luther King being shot earlier in the year, and things really just come to a head, especially in terms of violence among the populace at the Democratic National Convention. It is a utterly chaotic scene on the floor of the convention, and it really is. I mean, there are people that are still reeling from Kennedy's death. There are people who are absolutely against Humphrey, but they didn't want Johnson to actually run. There are all of these concerns about will Humphrey be able to beat the Republican candidate, which would more than likely be Richard Nixon. And so it's just utterly tumultuous, and you have many more street protests that are going on in 1968. And those street protests are going to be occurring around the convention center as well. And so it's just this point in time where everything is exploding in the United States. And it calms down because of the election of Richard Nixon and the fact that it's really a major defeat for the Democrats. It's a major defeat for people who are looking for the progression of the United States socially, culturally, and the concerns over what it means for the war. Everything just sort of, people shut down after the election of Nixon, and so we see a lot of the violence and the tumultuous nature of this time start to fade away. But 1968 is really this where everything pops, and so 1968 really has some pretty significant events that occur that will eventually not only affect the Vietnam conflict, but certainly affect the American political system as well. The Vietnamization of the Vietnam War is something that is often connected solely to Richard Nixon. And Nixon accelerates the Vietnamization of the war, but it's during the Johnson administration, it's during late 67, early 68, where there are these rumblings of maybe it's about time to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese, whether they're ready for it or not. And it was something that clearly was talked about for a while, that really one of the major objectives was, especially in terms of creating the South Vietnamese army and trying to shore up the South Vietnamese army, was that it really was an objective to get them to take over the bulk of the war so that the United States wouldn't have to do it. They wouldn't have to do it in terms of expenditures, in terms of bringing troops, and just trying to maintain some sort of distance from the conflict eventually. And it just never gets to the point where they're able to move away from South Vietnam. The United States isn't able to move away from South Vietnam because the South Vietnamese army never really gets its stuff together. And the bulk of South Vietnam is in pretty significant chaos because of the conflict between the peasantry, between the elite, and then the violence that's being perpetrated by the Viet Cong. And so the United States, the Johnson administration, is really starting to think in late 67, early 68 that this may be a wash. This may be something where we're going to have to move out. And Johnson is adamant, and you see it on the previous slide. Johnson is pretty adamant that we're not going to abandon them, and we're going to make sure that Vietnam is unified and under our understandings of how it should be unified. Then he backs off a little bit and he's like, well, at least we can keep South Vietnam. At least we can keep that and keep that in the image of the West. And then all of a sudden, in terms of his administration, his cabinet, they start talking a lot about the fact that they're going to hope to hold South Vietnam, but they want South Vietnam and South Vietnamese army to hold the line against the North themselves. And so they go back to a lot of the things that were going on in the Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration. So they go back to training programs. They go back to giving a lot of supplies and a lot of equipment, a lot of money. They do a lot of combined operations in the field, and they're really working hard to increase the South Vietnamese forces. And so the reason why I bring this up is again, it's often discussed as it being, it's Nixon who sends the war back and gives the war back to the South Vietnamese, right? And it's Nixon who is the one who should be blamed for what occurs in terms of the Vietnamization of the war. And we see this is something that's being discussed, and many things are being implemented in terms of Vietnamization well before Nixon is elected. So it's not just Nixon. Nixon accelerates it, but it's not just Nixon, right? And so their hope is, the United States, the Johnson administration, their hope is that they can stabilize South Vietnam. They can, number one, create this significant army. They can rebuild any of the cities and infrastructure that have been damaged by the Viet Cong. They can make economic reforms. They can push against corruption within the South Vietnamese government. And so they can stabilize in that way too. It doesn't just have to be militarily, because they're starting to worry a great deal about their ability to stabilize the military. But there are really significant problems in terms of giving this war, sending this war back to the Vietnamese people, or the South Vietnamese people. And that is that South Vietnam is in complete disarray. And so it's not just the fact that they can't rebuild or build a military. It's not just the idea that the North Vietnamese have gotten a pretty significant upper hand in terms of the court of public opinion. There's chaos in terms of the elites of South Vietnam are beginning to question what's going on and can the United States actually help us? And then you have the factionalism, where you have the rural peasantry that's against the elite, and then you have the Viet Cong, who are completely radicalized against the elite and against the United States. And so there's just so much turmoil. There's just so much that so many things that need to be fixed before the United States could even remotely think about turning things back over to the South Vietnamese. And so because the United States is doing all of this, because the United States is implementing policies that look very much to the South Vietnamese, that looks very much like the war being turned back over to them, or them getting to the point where it's going to be turned back over to them, that they're starting to get concerned about the United States abandoning them. And they really are not sure how to deal with that. They don't know how to deal with it in terms of the war, but they also don't know how to just deal with the fact that here they've been embroiled in all of this by the United States. And they're very happy, the elites are, they're very happy that the United States has been able to keep them in power. But what is all of this, once the United States is gone, what does this mean for the elite? What does it mean for the government itself? What does it mean for the military? And so there's significant concerns in two ways. One is that the North Vietnamese would be able to take over the South once the United States would leave. And the other concern for the South Vietnamese is really that they're concerned about what this really means for them in the long run. They're concerned about what it means about reunification of Vietnam, and there's just so many reasons for them to think that the United States is abandoning them and leaving them to their own devices. And they know that their own devices are not really going to withstand the North Vietnamese army. It's not going to withstand the desires of the initial followers of Ho Chi Minh. And so they really are just beside themselves, because they know, again, also that they have significant factionalism in their own midst. And so it just is a point in time where the South Vietnamese are like, what exactly is it that you want us to do? Now, obviously, they're at fault as well, because as I've been talking about, and as the documentary will show you, the South Vietnamese just really, it doesn't really look like they're trying, right, in terms of the military. It really doesn't look like, it's almost like, oh, well, the United States is here and they can do it for us, And so that's another concern, like, when they leave, we really shot ourselves in the foot in terms of this military, didn't we? Like, we didn't train the way we should have, and we didn't make ourselves in the image of the United States military, and what's going to happen to us, right? So the whole point of this is the idea that Vietnamization is occurring in 1968, and Vietnamization is occurring before Nixon is actually elected. So bear that in mind, and really recognize where we're at here in 1968, and the fact that the South Vietnamese are starting to feel as though the United States is going to cut and run. And that's going to obviously be a really significant issue for the South Vietnamese once we get to the early and mid 1970s. Well, here are your major points for this particular section of the course. Number one, obviously we've hammered this home quite a bit here in this particular summary lecture, but note that the United States does not really win or lose the Tet Offensive, that the United States, in the court of public opinion, lost the Tet Offensive, and in its own opinion made some considerable advances, right? And so it's able to thwart a lot of the efforts of the North Vietnamese. So it can't be seen as a full-fledged victory, obviously, but it is certainly something where the United States has these little wins, these little elements of the conflict, and these little elements of the objectives of the North Vietnamese that it's not only able to thwart, but actually bat them back a little bit, right? So bear that in mind, and understand really the importance of the Tet Offensive. I mean, but really, I do not in any way believe this is an overstatement. It is the most important point of this conflict. There is nothing else that could be more important in terms of warfare, in terms of battle, and even in terms of how people view the conflict. This is the point in time, right? The Tet Offensive. So that's obviously a major point in terms of this this section of the course. Note again, it's painted by the media as a significant loss for the United States, and the media really portrays it as the United States is losing control, right? It's not just that they lost in terms of the Tet Offensive. It's not just that they've supposedly, which they hadn't, had a setback, right? It's that I mean, this is it. They have lost control. The United States has lost control, and the media is portraying it as such over and over and over again. And so again, this is where the tide turns. This is the turning point of the conflict, but it's the turning point in terms of the United States and the American populace. And people who were supporting the war before are no longer supporting it, right? So they've flipped because of the Tet Offensive and because the portrayal of the Tet Offensive by the American media. And then we have Vietnamization, which is, again, something that's being discussed in late 67 before Tet, and then certainly in some great intense conversations and intense debates about this after the Tet Offensive. So Vietnamization is something that's on the table, and it's going to eventually ramp up in terms of the Nixon administration. Initially, Nixon ramps up military conflict, and then he brings Vietnamization back around. And this Vietnamization policy, this has its roots in the Johnson administration. It really is something that forces the South Vietnamese government and the South Vietnamese elites. It really sends them scrambling to hold their own rather. It really, for the military, for the South Vietnamese army, it really is this point in time where they are scrambling to keep their heads above water, right? And so Vietnamization is something that is just utterly devastating to the South of Vietnam. And for the United States, again, as I had mentioned before, it was the hope, right? It was the hope that the United States was going to be able to build that army. It was going to be able to settle conflicts within the South, and that there would at least be that strong state and hopefully the ability to unify all of Vietnam under the umbrella of the United States, and really in terms of how the United States wanted the South Vietnamese and or the totality of the Vietnamese government to operate, that it wanted it to be in its own image, right? It wanted it to be influenced by the United States, and it wanted it to conform to what the United States wanted, right? Much like a colony. And so it wasn't necessarily right in the image of the United States, but that's how it was being portrayed. And so at this point in time, I mean, we have the loss of a lot of these ideas, right? We have the loss of the hope that the South Vietnamese had in terms of being able to hold its own, being able to at least stave off the North. Maybe not have Vietnam as a whole, but at least, have this partitioned North and South. And for the South Vietnamese, this is where, again, they start feeling abandoned, right? They start feeling like this was the point all along, that you were going to try and make us stronger, and you haven't been able to do it. And is that our fault? Is that your fault? Is that a mixture of our faults? Who knows? But you can't leave us. And so this is really where, and you're going to see this in the documentary as we get closer to the end of the conflict, this is where we see this, where the South Vietnamese are so distraught. The elites are so distraught over the fact that they feel like they're being abandoned, right? So those are the major points. And just, again, keep in mind, we hammered this home in terms of Tet, but it really can't be hammered home enough how important Tet is and how Tet then leads us to the rest of our story, right? Vietnamization in particular, the fall of Saigon, all of that is really, it really hinges on Tet, okay? Okay,